Welcome to the Faces podcast. We're a Christian and Muslim charity working to build resilience in faith communities against child sexual exploitation and other forms of harm. We'll be talking about what faith and interfaith work means to us and how we embed an inclusive and authentic approach throughout our work.
Hello and welcome to our podcast from Faces in Luton. And my name's Nigel. I'm on the staff team here, along with Melissa, who joins us on this podcast, and Rehana, who's one of the founders of Faces. And we're going to have a discussion today on a few current news articles. And we're going to be looking at three of them that we've picked out of the news that's around in the last couple of weeks. One where we did an article on Andrew Tate last week, looking at his arrest in Romania for exploitation. And that story seems to be continuing in our press. And there's an article on the BBC News, which is explaining that schools are having to think about how to educate young people who've been taken in by some of the misogyny and some of the viewpoints, and what schools are doing. So that's one article we'd like to look at. The other one is Shamima Begum has launched a podcast, and so that's in the news as well this week. And so we'd like to look at that and have a discussion about that and the fact that that story is re-emerging. The other one that we'd like to look at is the sad story of the tragic death of Rehana and Rudd, who died last year. And she was groomed by an extremist in America, and sadly, through many different reasons, ended her own life. Sadly, at the end of last year. So there's some of those stories we want to focus on. Faces has a focus on child protection, has a focus on safeguarding, has a focus of on inclusion, and so as a result of that, we've picked these stories, and there's a running thread through the three of them, and the thread is grooming. And in all the situations, there's a kind of grooming of young people and their ideology with Andrew Tate as perceived by the schools in that article by the BBC. There is Shamima Begum, who some people view it as grooming, some people view it as her. There's a whole load of controversy over that, which is all around the podcast. And also you've got this young girl who took her own life as a result of someone grooming. And I think in some ways we're all human. We're all full of faults and failings and good points and bad. I don't think I've met anyone that hasn't had some good points in them. But sometimes the bad points outweigh the good. And in these things, we are human beings, but we're also susceptible to things. The ability to be groomed by something or taken on by some thoughts and some ideas and things like that is something I think we're all vulnerable to some extent. And the three stories we've got here kind of highlight some of that impact of what grooming does. I think also in domestic violence and things like that, there's a certain mindset where people think, oh, well, I can't really change. It gets into their thinking, and it takes a long time to detox from that. I remember speaking to someone who had been through a situation like that, saying, it just feels someone's in my head and I don't want them in my head anymore. And it takes a long time to work through some of those things. And so I hope our discussion today, as we're meeting, discussing these different articles, actually helps us look at the whole issue of grooming, which is very alive and current in our news. And if it's current in our news, it's current in society, it's current around us. And so therefore these things are very important to discuss and look at. And so I think probably the one to start with, which draws more of the subject up, the others have very key illustrations on it, is the Andrew Tate article from the BBC, and we'll have these in our notes underneath the podcast, so people can follow that or look up the articles or hear the podcasts if they would like to do that. But basically, Andrew Tate is described in this article as intelligent, articulate, disciplined. That's how a secondary school teacher described Andrew Tate. But she says the problem is he's also pathetic, insecure, and promotes Taliban beliefs on how to treat women. And I think that article raises some things. I don't think that is all about Andrew Tate's viewpoints, and I don't think that is what drives it. He was on many of these viewpoints before any look into religion seems to have occurred. But I think there's some articles there on how teachers are looking at this and thinking how do they help young people who are taken in by some of these things. I had a thing ping up on my Instagram this week, which said, today, as I'm preparing for this, it pings up and goes, Andrew Tate's helped this person and given money to this person, and that's what he's been attacked for. And there's a man on there going, I'd rediscovered my masculinity by these thoughts. He's helped save me. He's saved my life. He's rescued me. And you've got all these things being said on social media as he's up for trial in Romania, for exploiting women, for some of the things that have been going on there. There's even a lot of rumors around, and it's a story that's playing out. So we're not saying he's guilty. We're not saying any of those kind of things. It's a story that's emerging. We don't know how it'll end up, but these are some of the approaches taken in school. So I don't know if either of you would like to chip in to that story or comment on any of the things I've said and bring that on further. I'll just open it up.
I think there's a few things that as you've been speaking, my mind has sort of jumped all over different places, and I guess I just wanted to open up by drawing on the quote there from the BBC article where the teacher describes his attitudes as being the Taliban beliefs. I think part of the problem here is really understanding why his ideas have had such, why so many young men have bought into these ideas. And by describing them as Taliban beliefs, what that teacher has done is otherize misogyny, and to say it's part of this other culture belief system. It's alien to us, and we have now got to kind of detoxify our young men. And I think it really ignores the multiple ways in misogyny and sexism is entrenched in our society, in our language, in our attitudes, in our beliefs. They have young men, young boys are not clinging on to this as a new idea. It's an expansion of ideas, and undoubtedly kind of the really, really crude and ugly representations of it. But those are Andrew Tate's ideas, are rooted in and are replicated in society in multiple ways. And I think we've got to take ownership for that and recognize the way in which those ideas circulate within our communities. They're not other. Ask any woman from any background, and they will be able to give examples and experiences of misogyny and sexism that they've experienced from men and sadly indeed women of all backgrounds. So that's the first thing I'd want to say, is that we really need to take ownership of the world that we live in, of the ideas that circulate in it, and the ways in which we as individuals and societies perpetuate those ideas. That's the first thing I'll say. And then we can talk about some other issues in terms of grooming and how that works perhaps later on. I'll hand over to Melissa. I know she's got something to say.
That was a really, really good point, Rehana, and that was the line that I saw most in that article as well, is describing these Taliban beliefs, because it not only does exactly everything that you've said, makes it a problem that is other and that isn't actually a problem in the UK. It's just he's adopted these wrong kind of perceptions from somewhere else. But it also, in trying to safeguard young boys, as the article was mostly talking about, and teenagers from the influence of misogyny and the normalizing of abuse and things like that the whole narrative around Andrew Tate does. It's also, we can't really deny the fact that as soon as you say Taliban, there's an association with Muslims. And therefore any Muslims who may or may not have been in that class, it's suddenly now your message isn't for me because I'm one of the bad guys in this scenario. And so that kind of language coming from a teacher and actually being so open about then having that in a national news report is really troubling. It really shows just how normal it is to create these negative associations with no consideration at all for the young people in that scenario. Or rather, it highlights that there's only a particular kind of young person in mind when giving that kind of message.
Yeah, and I think the religious literacy in it is an issue as well. I think the misogyny that they're trying to tackle, I think one of the difficulties is to tackle it from secularism. You haven't got a written document saying these are our secularist beliefs and these are entrenched and this is what people follow. Whereas with religions, you do. And so it's much easier to attack a religion when you've got a vagueness, but it also, when you're looking for something that expresses it in a solid way, you haven't got anything to base things on. And I think this is part of the problem for teachers approaching it with a lack of religious literacy. It's very difficult to find something solid to label it apart from misogyny. And I think the way it's written, I think is kind of, I think for young guys, there's a looking at what does it mean to be masculine? And there's a lot of things going on in society that don't answer that question. So they get the idea it's sex, it's violence, it's a whole load of flashy cars and material possessions and signs of success are in some way where you grow up without a strong male role model. Those things are taken by media to be the things that masculinity may be about. It has been a strong thing that I think's been around. And I think that's where I see it, this plays into, because he's a kickboxer who's won some championships at a world level. He's got a chess background from his father. He's got all these flashy cars. What color is your your posh car? There's all of those kind of things that are trying to appeal, and that's why it's so difficult. So without being able to teach on saying, well, a good man is this in your school lesson, it's very difficult to counteract that narrative. And it's also, why should people listen to your narrative when they're getting this bombarded at them on social media all the time? And so I think some of these, this thought process is very difficult to tackle with some of these young men, unless they can get to see the picture of themselves grown up. What kind of person am I going to become? And I think there's some important factors around that. And I think religion has a lot to bring into that. But where you decide not to have religion in the picture, I think that's very difficult as well. And so I think there's a lot of things going on with this that play into this narrative. I don't know if you've got more to add to that or whether I've provoked other things. But
I just think so much of it is about language, isn't it? Like we're talking about Taliban beliefs, we're talking about masculinity and ideas of gender and what's acceptable and acceptance and respect and all of those things. I think perhaps we've come a bit too far in throwing all these different terms at young people when we explore gender, masculinity, feminism, all of these things. And we worry less about what those things actually mean. Because now, just like we're saying that masculinity is such a big part of this, ideas of it, and I suppose a sense of not knowing what it is, so therefore needing to listen to someone who's telling you what it is perhaps where we're missing a trick, because we're throwing all these words at teenagers without really telling them what's right and wrong, or at least what's, what level of society has as acceptable and not. And just on the language point as well, in the Rhiannon Rudd article, there was a line that described the person who was later found to be grooming her, I think, as part of a violent form of Nazism. And I realised that since when do we need to add that kind of caveat of violent form? Because the definition in itself, the ideology itself, tells you that it's about violence, and about hurting other people. And I found it interesting that we wouldn't likely see a similar necessary description if we were talking about Islamists, for example. But it really does show how we shape these different narratives depending on who the victim is, who the perpetrators are. And, going back to my first point, that language is really important in what children are hearing and seeing when they read these stories.
Yeah. Just to pick up on that, Melissa, it's not just about who the victim and the perpetrators are, but how acceptable some of those ideologies are. So, violent forms of neo-Nazism, as opposed to non-violent forms of neo-Nazism. But I think there is certainly, when we hear when we talk about different forms of extremism, when we think about our threshold of saying, actually, that's gone too far now, there is a differential between different forms of, quote unquote, extremisms that we might say, use the example of Islamism and neo-Nazism. And I think, whilst I've just repeated them, as I repeated them, I'm almost thinking that actually those ideas are so diverse within themselves of what that word means, what Islamism means, to potentially all three of us, is again part of the problem, because these are just words that many people use in many different contexts that will mean multiple different things. I choose not to use it actually because its usage is so both diverse and inflammatory that you can't actually have a reasonable discussion about it. And I think that's potentially one of the issues around, overarching, whether we're talking about Rhiannon Rudd, whether we're talking about Shamima Begum, who we haven't discussed so far yet, whether we're talking about the influence of Andrew Tate. I think the overarching problem is that we really struggle to it's about the world that we live in, but there's no level playing field for young people on these issues. There's no kind of sort of ground that we start to build upon. It's widely, people have commented on social media, in the media, in discussions I've had with people, there is a massive difference between the response to Shamima Begum and Rhiannon Rudd. Both are pretty tragic stories. Both are young people who were, groomed, young people who were seen to be in violent, difficult situations, and we responded to them in different ways. And that tells us a lot about the acceptability of particular discourses, but it also tells us something about the way that we see victims and victimhood. And I remember a few years back, I wrote about Shamima Begum, I think at the time that Sajid Javid stripped her of her citizenship. And it was in researching that I read about Sammy's Law. The Sammy's Law was being promoted by the then Victims Commissioner, by many chief constables, including ours at Bedfordshire, by John Boucher. And Sammy's Law was put forward by one of the victims of on-street grooming, Sammy Woodhouse. And it essentially said that, young people groomed under the influence of abusers should not be held responsible for the crimes that they commit whilst under the influence of groomers and abusers. And again, widely supported by police officers, by those who understand, who should understand what victims' experiences are. And yet we're unable to apply that to certain young people. When we're unable to see that when it comes to the likes of Shamima Begum, and I can only conclude that that's because of what she looks like and what we associate with people who look like Shamima. I actually had a quick listen to her podcast or the podcast that the BBC have released this morning, and she probably gets it. I think at one point she says that when people look at me, they see ISIS. And that's part of the problem, is that they look at her and there are all sorts of violent ideas attached to her related to ISIS, whether she had anything to do with those things or not, or whether she knew about them or not. All of that hasn't really been explored or discussed at all. What we have been presented with oftentimes is somebody, the traitor who travelled. We're going to ignore her age. And I've got a 14-year-old. And I've got older children who have been through that sort of age. And the idea that a 14, 15-year-old has complete agency is bonkers. It's just something that it's really difficult to get your head around. But I also wonder, when young people see and read these sort of things, what effect does it have on them? We often talk to young people, and we there's all of these kind of workshops and assemblies and things we do about disclosing abuse. How do you disclose abuse when those are the kind of narratives that you're hearing? The amount of responsibility placed on young people to recognize it, and then if it's there, to go away from it. But if they step into it, then they'll be blamed for it. What does that leave young people thinking and feeling?
It's such a good point.
Yeah.
Such a good point. And also with the Rhiannon Rudd story, there was so many times that services failed her to actually intervene, where something could have been done to help her. And perhaps a lot of that was to do with a perception of, her not fitting the description of a young girl who'd be radicalized because she wasn't Muslim. And there were so many different times where the abuse and exploitation and grooming, evidence was given that it wasn't acted upon until it was too late. And so in both cases, the girls Shamima Begum and Rhiannon Rudd were failed by systems that are supposed to be set up to protect them. So just coming back to your point of, we tell young people to disclose abuse, to, share their concerns. But if I'm a young person and I read about these stories where one is left in Syria and stripped of her citizenship, another ended up taking her life because she wasn't helped when she could have been. Mm-hmm. It's a really strong and really dangerous message that they're hearing.
Yeah, and I think it's also the backstory to these things is very. In years gone by, people were just measured, they did this is the result. There was no understanding of what grooming was happening behind the scenes, what other things were being done. And I think the interesting thing for me in this is Shamima's podcast being released with the claim, we're going to get to the bottom of this. We're going to find out, and for the first time, the real truth is coming out about this, the whole thing. I think that's a bold boast, but it certainly does get people watching it, and listening to it. But I think with this, I think there's a number of episodes to go. There's a lot of different things. On GMTV the other day, I just saw an article in passing, and they were debating this podcast. And that was the main article on Good Morning TV here in the UK. And as they're bringing that, you've got a former Met officer who was on the podcast that we listened to, and he was very, very strong on the grooming side of things. Whereas you had a journalist who'd prepared a podcast years ago who was very down on Shamina because of untruths he could see in the story. And you had these two arguments, but the other guy was bringing the grooming side into that, because it's very hard to piece pieces together and have memory of things when you've been through some of these processes of grooming and things. So there's a lot in this that I think we have yet to discover about grooming, that I think podcasts like Shamina's are going to bring out. And I think there's some of these things that are worth looking at and following. And here on Faces, as we look at these stories, some of them are emerging, some of them are going to run for some time. And we're very happy to come back and comment on some of these. But I just wondered if you had any comments on the grooming side of things, and that kind of thought of how you get some of that out of your system, and the restoring of young people who've been through grooming processes. And I know we've looked into some of this, and how does that restoration take place, and how do the tools that we use to influence the person get turned around. I mean, are there building blocks out of that? Is faith good for that? I just want to just throw that out a little bit, because I think both of you are probably far more clued into some of this than I am, and I just think it'd be useful to hear that.
I'll just try to give a brief response to that. And the brief response is really, really difficult, because the process of grooming, and it's called grooming, for a reason, young people or even adults, it all alters the way that you think. It alters your perceptions. It alters your ideas of what is right and what is wrong. And the groomers, can create a really strong kind of emotional connection, and those who are being groomed can create a really strong emotional connection to the person they're being groomed by. And we've heard, if people want to look back at some of those accounts during the ICSA inquiry, you hear some really powerful accounts of grooming and how it happens. And how just all-consuming that person or those ideas become in someone's life. And I particularly remember, if people want to look them up, that there was a football coach, I think of the name now, Barry Bennell. And they're talking young boys talking about the way that they were abused by him, the processes is, it's really quite harrowing, and it's easy to see, how young people, how these young men got kind of so wrapped up and just felt unable to do anything about what was happening to them, even if it felt horrific. And sometimes it doesn't feel horrific. That's the thing as well, because the way that you're thinking, your ideas of what's acceptable and what's not are completely altered by the grooming process. And we recognise that. I think we read, even in the case of Shamima Begum, why we want to say, we don't think she was groomed. When we're calling a 15-year-old an ISIS bride, what are we saying? None of us think that when we use those phrases, none of us are thinking, she's going off to Syria to fight a war. ISIS bride is showing that we recognise what she is going to Syria for. She's spoken about this sort of idyllic imagery she's had of finding her family there. But it's we're not saying the obvious out loud, but we are condoning and justifying the rape of a 15-year-old. When we use that in that kind of throwaway comment. We know what she went for, and we know what happened to her. She was a 15-year-old child. So that's, in terms of what grooming does, I think it's important to recognize the way that it takes over somebody's life. And when we recognize that, I think we also then see how difficult it is to detangle oneself from that. The stories one has told ourselves in order to justify the stuff that we've done, or the way that we've behaved, or our actions in the past. And we now need to detangle ourselves from that. We need to detangle ourselves from the bond that we've made with our abuser. And in order to survive, in order to be able to live through what has happened, people find that very difficult to do, very difficult to acknowledge what's happened. And that might take, years, it might take decades. And sadly, for some, it is unable to do, but people have to be given the grace and time and support to be able to do that. But it's a very, very tough journey.
Yeah, thanks, Rehana, and I think that's very helpful in looking at that. And I think what I'm listening to as I'm hearing you say that is, I'm thinking the dehumanization of others, or the separation from other people's humanity, enables a lot of evil to happen. And actually, that managing to keep people's humanity in view and in focus is really important. It's when we view people as others that things fall down, where we can even dehumanize journalists, but that horrible lot over there, or we can dehumanize lots of different groups. It's where we keep an understanding of the frailness of humanity, but also the faults of humanity in all of us. In some ways, working that through helps a better. And I suppose that's one of the keys with grooming, that has an effect of maybe even thinking of yourself less, and dehumanizing yourself as part of that process. But it's where that happens. I think that's got to be one of the building blocks moving further forward. I don't know if you've got any final things to add, Melissa.
Yeah. I'm just listening about what you were saying, both of you just now, and I think part of what people outside of the situation can do to support someone who's been groomed, being exploited, is remembering to look at things holistically and contextually, and addressing the point of exploitation as well. So whether that's that's what gives or helps reinforce that hold that someone has over another person, is because you have a dependency, because you need me for drugs, for shelter, for care, for love, or perceptions of it. And so rather than addressing the victim in that situation's perhaps drug misuse as a completely separate problem on its own, but actually seeing that as much part of removing that hold that the abuser who's supplying the drugs as a way of keeping control over that person has. And I think we could draw comparisons even with Shamima Begum in that circumstance. If she's doesn't have a home, literally stateless, and doesn't have anywhere to go, that's not having that 15-year-old victim survivor in mind, and how we can best help her, because that's just creating another power that someone can have over her by providing her a home, by providing her a sense of belonging and a sense of care and love and all the rest of it. So these things aren't sort of separate issues, and I think it shows that in her circumstance especially, it wasn't the safeguarding of a child or a young adult who was a child when she was first groomed and left the UK. And that's what the focus should be. In all of these stories, there's so much political and racial and other kinds of sort of much broader societal concepts that do need to be acknowledged and unpacked as part of it. But actually, we're talking about like individual young people's lives, children's lives in this. And we can't miss that through all the conversation and all the definitions and all of the the acknowledging the broader impact of things and how it might also affect other young people and all the rest of it is important. But if you're the person dealing with the specific case of abuse or the specific, concern that's been made apparent about a child, that child needs to be the focus, not be hidden amongst all of the other noise, I suppose.
Yeah. Thanks, Melissa. And I think these stories will run and run, and our knowledge of things and our ability to input into things will increase, hopefully. But if you're listening to this and you feel you're in a situation where you've either been through grooming or you've been through some form of situation there, we just encourage you to get help. If you're in a current situation and you're a young person, Childline would be a very good place to go and get in touch with them. But there's also local authorities and other people who can help in these situations. And so we'd encourage you to get in touch with people. I know there's some very good organizations into domestic abuse, like Home Start and some of these organizations around different areas in the UK that can be very helpful in helping detox from some of these. I know there's a manual probably about 2 inches thick that women work through to help work out of some of these situations. So just we realize these stories will run. Our discussion on them will run as well. But we'll come to an end today. But just encourage you, seek the help if you can get it, if you need it, inquire. There's plenty of places to get that from. But thank you very much for listening. Thank you, Rehana, and thank you, Melissa, as well. It's been fun, good to discuss these things today.